Let's get into some of the themes that you deal with in On Tyranny in the book. You mentioned the great Jewish philologist Victor Klemperer, who studied the way that the Nazis used language. They subtly changed the meaning in an almost Orwellian sense, I guess. They commandeered everything else, but first it was language. Language was the sort of foot in the door, the narrow edge of the wedge.
This is something that is extremely important and which we've lost track of. And in an odd way, the very atrocity of where the Nazi regime ends can draw our attention away from how it begins. So often in discussions of authoritarianism, people will say, but look, we don't have death camps killing millions of Jews, therefore everything's okay. And the real question is, what were the necessary conditions to get from 1933 to 1941 or 1942 when the Holocaust gets underway? So in these lessons in the book, the ones about language or the ones about public symbolism, I'm thinking about Germany in 1933, and I'm thinking about one of the things that historians of Nazi Germany tend to agree about, which is that what was permissible in public spaces, and then what was acceptable or what was normalized in political language opened people's imagination for what was possible in politics. And so that then is a necessary condition which happens early, and it's something that one has to try to arrest, try to stop early if at all possible, or at least notice. So in the public signs, for example, after Mr. Trump was elected, swastikas just became a lot more common in the U.S. In rural New England, in urban New York, more people were putting up more swastikas. On the other hand, more organizations were formed to get up early in the morning and paint over those swastikas, which is something that I think you have to do, and that's a lesson that we learned from 33. With language, there's not a whole lot that one can do to change the way Mr. Trump talks, but one can be aware that there are certain things that he does which have consequences. Part of it is style, the way that he presents himself as the voice of the people, which is something that Hitler actually said. The idea that the speaker is the voice of the people, and therefore all the laws and institutions in between are irrelevant. The fascist directly represents the people. Some of it are some of the things he says, like the way this is an example from Klemperer, where Trump will talk about the people, but what he means by the people is some part of the population, not all the citizens. He clearly means some group against which, one is defining some enemies. Those people are not really the people, even though they're technically the citizens. These are examples of the kinds of things one has to be aware of. And in general, one has to be aware that the language matters. So one trap that people can fall into is that if Mr. Trump is vulgar, or if Mr. Trump uses certain phrases, then people try to be vulgar themselves, or they try to turn those phrases around. And that's a sort of trap. It's very important to call him on what he does, both the vulgarities, the fascism, the oversimplifications, and the outright lies, which are almost countless. It's important to keep track of all that. But it's also very important for people to be mindful about how they use language themselves, because that's that's one form of self-defense, how we use the language.
One of the most chilling things that you say in the book actually is, and I'm quoting you here, most of the power of authoritarianism is freely given. What do you mean by freely given?
Well, that might be chilling as a description of us, but it's also, or should be, encouraging as a description for the possibilities of political action in the early stages of authoritarian regime change, which is where the United States is right now. So what's meant is that it has a temporal dimension, a psychological dimension, political dimension. Usually authoritarian regime changes take place over a fair bit of time. Again, Germany is a good example. Hitler doesn't consolidate power completely in Germany until well into the 1930s, and the control of the parliamentary system, takes roughly a year. The elimination of political rivals, roughly a year. And so, if you're an authoritarian that you're trying to change the regime, the trick is to immobilize people for enough time for you to make these basic changes. So, if you're a citizen, the trick is to recognize that something is afoot and not to obey in advance, to recognize that what's happening now is different from other things that you've experienced before. in your life and not to give your consent. And so by consent, what we mean here is something like crossing the street away from people who you think might be suspect, or looking away from that swastika on the wall instead of painting it over, or adapting the way that you talk to make it sound more like the speech of the authorities. These are all ways of expressing consent. And again, this is something that we think we understand about 1933. So you can't just kind of go along and normalize with little steps, which is what people generally do. That's what people generally do, and that's why the power of authoritarians is freely given, especially at the beginning. You have to stop yourself at the beginning. That's the time dimension, and you have to make this. You have to have a psychological breakthrough where you say, "Look, this is not normal. I'm going to behave in a different way." The thing is, if you do that, then you have a chance of doing other things later on. And the political dimension of this is that if you don't get out front of authoritarian regime changes, then they're over before you know it, which is why it's so very important that a march happened in the U.S. the day after the inauguration. It's so very important that the legal challenges began in the days and weeks after the inauguration. It's so very important that all kinds of small groups began to act right away. Not that Americans have done such a great job, but it's very important that something happened in the beginning.
We live in very confusing times, and we've done shows here on American fascism. We did a show on Posttruth and what that means. And I want to call now on your historical knowledge again on what happened, those many years ago when all of this seemed to be happening once before. I mean, the new media was very important in the expansion of fascist ideas. Radio, I hate to say it, confess, was a very important factor in what was going on. And, there was talk about truth, what truth was. And I wonder if you can basically, I guess, draw parallels once again between then and now.
Well, let me try to draw two. The first is the history of communications technology, which you quite rightly say is very interesting. So the very technologies that we find pacifying and civilized now, like print and like radio, have a terrifying history. When the printing press was invented, it gave rise to 150 years of religious war. I mean, there were other reasons for it, but the fact that people could carry out these polemics over this new medium was one reason why differences suddenly clarified and heresies suddenly seemed objectionable, and armies went to war. We associate the book with the Enlightenment, but that's after a couple of centuries of religious war. Likewise, as you say, with the radio, we're talking over the radio. Listening to the radio is a luxury now. It's one of these things that we do when we want to calm down and collect our thoughts. But in the 20s and 30s, precisely, it was a mass medium which was used to get people out on the streets. It was used to get people to think the same things at the same time. That was the idea that the Nazis had, which brings us to the internet. So the internet comes around. That, of course, people say this new communications technology is going to, give us access to information. It's going to make us all equal. It's going to be pacifying. And the opposite's the case, roughly speaking. Politically, the opposite is the case. And I would just say that historically speaking, that's not surprising. We should expect that a new communications technology is going to have a period of hopefully not centuries, but decades, but definitely decades, where it's going to be fundamentally disruptive. Not disruptive in the cutesy Silicon Valley way, but disruptive in the sense of breaking the way that politics and society had worked. It's going to take some time for us to recover, I think, from the damage that the internet has done to our ability to communicate normal ideas politically. And things will never be exactly the same. But that it's a huge disruption is not surprising. The question is what we do now, which is the second parallel, the truth. It's really, you're very much on target, I think, when you suggest that the traditional or the 20th century tyrannies had a specific attitude about truth. Fascism said, look, don't attend to the facts of everyday life. The real truth is the spiritual bond of the nation or the mythical connection of the nation and the leader. Lenin, the Bolsheviks said, look, it's not so much the actual facts that matter. What really matters is the deeper truth that in the future there's going to be the socialist utopia. And if we have to bend the truth or even completely destroy the truth to get there, that's worth it, because the world that we're in now is fragmented and corrupt and fundamentally miserable. But there's a better world out there, and that's the deep truth. So in the 21st century, we see this again, but without the promise of utopia. So it's rare that people on the far right or the far left are promising perfect unity with the people or a class utopia in the future. But what you do get is an attack on the truth, which usually takes the form more like, I don't know and you don't know and no one really knows and maybe there isn't really truth. And this is the ideological basis or even the practical basis of a new kind of authoritarianism, where the way you handle things is that you get control of media and you spread total doubt about everything. And once everyone kind of shrugs their shoulders cynically, you govern by spectacle. And this already happened in Russia, and it's what Mr. Trump is very clearly trying to do in the United States. His main domestic policy is the demolition of truth. He lies all the time, ceaselessly. I mean, to the point where it's clearly not, he's not making mistakes. This is clearly programmatic. And that's step one. And step two is he then says, oh, well, it's not me, it's the journalists who are lying. And then he says fake news, fake news, fake news, fake news over and over and over again until it penetrates people's skulls and they start applying it to the journalists as well. And then step three, nobody believes anyone anymore. There are no authorities. There are no facts left. And as that happens, your own reality starts to shift. So something like that is the pattern of 21st century authoritarianism. And it definitely has to do with the very conscious demolition of factuality.
As an historian, you know that hindsight is always 20/20, and that's a very valid explanation for how Trump came to power. But people are still scratching their head and wondering how it happened. I mean, what went on? I'm fascinated that you point out that somebody who did get it, who understood in advance, were people in Ukraine, and journalists in Ukraine sort of said, "Yep, Trump's going to win that election."
Yeah, I mean, there was kind of a clear moment where a friend of mine who's a Ukrainian journalist, I helped her get to Ohio. And within 36 hours of landing in the place, she'd understood fundamental things which Americans somehow couldn't see. And she called the election, she called the state, she called the election. And she was right when most of us were wrong. And during 2016, Russians and Ukrainians generally looked at Trump and said, we get the logic of this. They had seen this kind of thing before. The use of technology, the out-of-the-box rhetoric, the confusion of spectacle with reality, the possibilities that opened before you when you were willing to lie all the time about everything and break all the rules. The way that people find that refreshing for a moment, and before they know it, they're drawn in and trapped. But the reference to Russia and Ukraine reveals something else about how Mr. Trump was possible, which I wouldn't want to overlook, which is structural economic inequality. Russia and Ukraine, especially Russia, are places with stupefying economic inequality. And in that situation, one way that you govern is like this. You govern with spectacle. You govern by giving people promises of a return to a better past. And you get support from people who think that they're at a dead end. As Mr. Trump put it when he announced his candidacy, he said, the American dream is dead. And that got him a lot of support from people who really have been doing very badly in the U.S. since about the 1980s. Not that he didn't have any policy responses, but he acknowledged that there was a big problem. And if it hadn't been for that acknowledgement, I don't think that he would have won. And if it hadn't been for the inequality, I don't think he would have had a chance.